At 3:02 in the afternoon, on April 5, 2010, a massive coal dust explosion tore through Upper Big Branch Mine South in West Virginia. 29 miners were killed. 2 survived with injuries. Investigators would determine that the explosion began as a methane ignition, originating at the intersection of the active longwall face and the number 7 entry of Tailgate 1 North. What followed the blast was a forensic search, not just through the rubble, but through the records. And what investigators found in those records would reframe the disaster entirely, not as an unforeseeable accident, but as a failure that had been written down, documented, and deliberately concealed. Beneath the mountain, the geology itself was working against the miners. Investigators determined that as the long wall advanced, it cut into a fault zone, a geological formation that acted as both a reservoir and a conduit for methane. Gas began liberating from floor fractures behind the long wall shields, near the tailgate where the explosion would eventually begin. The mine's own approved roof control plan had anticipated the need for protection in exactly this area. It required 2 rows of supplemental supports, 8-foot cable bolts or posts, installed between the primary supports along the longwall tailgate entry. PCC/Massey installed only 1. That single missing row of supports would set off a cascade. Without adequate overhead reinforcement, the tailgate roof gave way, a fall that physically narrowed the passage through which fresh air was meant to flow. With airflow restricted, there was no longer enough ventilation to dilute or carry away the methane rising from the floor. The gas accumulated, present, measurable, and dangerous, with nowhere to go. Each failure had followed from the last. A fault zone, an unsupported roof, a fallen passage, a pocket of gas. The physical conditions for catastrophe were in place. The question was whether anyone with authority to act had been permitted to see them. Beneath the surface of the official record, the mine itself told a different story. Throughout the northern section of the mine, loose coal, coal dust, and float coal dust had accumulated across the floor, against the ribs, and in piles left from scooping, hazards present at every turn. The remedy for coal dust in an underground mine is rock dusting, coating exposed surfaces with pulverized limestone to suppress the explosive potential of the dust. But in the longwall tailgate entries, rock dusting had not been performed since the longwall went into production in September 2009. Testimony described those entries, along with the crossover between HG22 and TG22 and the glory hole area, as simply black, bare coal surfaces where protective dust should have been. When investigators surveyed the affected area after the explosion, the scale of that neglect came into sharp focus. 90.5% of the affected area was inadequately rock dusted at the time of the explosion. This was not a localized lapse. It was a condition that had settled into the mine's fabric over months, visible, measurable, and waiting. Every regulated mine is required to keep examination books, records open by law to federal inspectors and to miners themselves. At Upper Big Branch, PCC/Massey maintained 2 sets of books, the required examination books available for regulatory review, and a separate set of production and maintenance books kept strictly for internal use. When investigators finally gained access to both, the difference between them was not cosmetic. The internal books recorded hazards and violations of law, conditions that PCC/Massey chose not to carry over into the required examination books that inspectors were shown. The required books, the only ones a regulator would ever see, stood as a clean account of a mine operating within the law. The hazards existed in writing. They were documented. They simply lived in a drawer no inspector was directed to open. The dual record system did not stand alone. It was supported by a web of practices designed to ensure regulators never saw what the internal books contained. When a federal inspector approached the mine, surface personnel at Upper Big Branch would radio ahead. Miners underground received word before the inspector ever descended. This was illegal under the Mine Act. Giving advance notice of an MSHA inspection is explicitly prohibited by statute. PCC Massey did it routinely. The effect was precise. With warning came the opportunity to conceal. Violations were addressed, obscured, or simply moved out of sight before enforcement personnel arrived. And if advance notice was the shield, intimidation was the silence behind it. Miners who worked in those conditions were told directly that raising safety concerns with MSHA would cost them their jobs. Management made clear that the choice between speaking and working was theirs to make. The result was a silence that stretched across years. In the approximately 4 years before the explosion, not a single safety complaint or whistleblower disclosure reached MSHA from a miner working inside Upper Big Branch. 2 records, advance warnings, and a workforce too afraid to speak. Each element reinforced the others, constructing a regulatory blind spot so complete that the hazards documented internally never surfaced in the official view. A mine inspection is only as reliable as the records an inspector is allowed to read. The examination books revealed that PCC Massey had failed to carry out required pre-shift, on-shift, and weekly examinations, the routine checks designed to catch hazards before they became catastrophes. And on the occasions when the books did show that examiners had walked the mine, those entries recorded nothing wrong, even as accumulations of loose coal dust, and float coal dust sat in the very area where the explosion would later ignite. The hazards were not invisible. They were simply unacknowledged by examiners who either never went looking or who looked and wrote down nothing. Either way, the official record showed a mine that had been checked and found safe. The real condition of the mine never reached the page that a regulator would ever see. Every hidden failure has a moment when concealment ends. The dual record system had separated what was known from what was shown, but it could not separate what was known from what was present. When ignition occurred at the fault zone, it did not encounter the mine described in the official examination book. It encountered the mine described in the other one. The hazards that had been documented internally but withheld from regulators did not disappear because they were absent from the official record. They accumulated, undisturbed, because that record had kept anyone with authority to act from ever seeing them. A single ignition event does not create that kind of consequence on its own. It inherits everything left unaddressed before it. A hidden record documents a hazard. That hazard, unseen by regulators, waits. When the methane near the tailgate ignited, it found something waiting for it. Coal dust, accumulated throughout the mine and never addressed. Because the records shown to inspectors never said it was there. That initial methane explosion propagated into a coal dust explosion. As the flame moved through the accumulated fuel, the dual record system had effectively concealed from regulatory view. This is what parallel documentation ultimately protects. Not paperwork, but the conditions paperwork is meant to eliminate. In the aftermath, investigators did not stop at the official record. They searched further, through offices, through desks, through the spaces where paperwork accumulates and is never meant to be found. What they recovered was the other set of books. The internal records that had never left the building, never crossed a regulator's desk, never entered the official archive. Side by side, the two systems told entirely different stories about the same mine on the same days. The hidden documentation did not deny the hazards. It recorded them, methodically, in the ordinary language of daily examination, and then kept them out of sight. This is what forensic investigation is sometimes required to do. Look past the record that was offered and find the record that was withheld. The concealment had worked precisely because it was bureaucratic rather than dramatic. No documents were destroyed. The hazards were simply written into one book and kept out of another. When investigators laid both records open, the architecture of the deception became plain. Compliance existed on paper, and only on paper, in the version prepared for outside eyes. The lesson carved into the record of this investigation is durable. An official document is only as reliable as the system that ensures nothing is being withheld alongside it. When investigators arrive after a disaster, their first instinct is to reach for the official record, the book the company was required to keep, the one regulators reviewed, the one that said everything was in order. But the lesson of dual documentation is that the official record can be the least reliable document in the building. If a safeguard depends on transparent bookkeeping, and the bookkeeping itself has been corrupted at the source, the safeguard does not merely fail, it actively conceals the failure. Post-incident forensics must therefore treat the official record as a starting point, not an end point, and must assume that parallel systems of documentation may exist, maintained precisely because they were never meant to be seen. The drawer, not the desk, may hold the truth,